July 19th, 1945, 10:35 hours. Devon, England. The morning sun filtered through the windows of the medical hut, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. 23 women sat on benches along the wall, waiting in silence. They had been told to report for inspection. Nothing more. No explanation. No details. Just medical hut, 10:30 hours, mandatory attendance. Elizabeth Hartman sat near the end of the bench, her hands folded in her lap, her back straight despite exhaustion. She was 28, a former administrative clerk from the Luftwaffe, and she had learned over 3 months of captivity that silence was safer than questions. A British sergeant entered, tall, middle-aged, with a Red Cross armband. Behind him, a younger private carried a large canvas bag. The sergeant consulted a clipboard, then looked up. "Right," he said in heavily accented German. "We need to check your clothing. For lice. For tears. For replacement." The women exchanged glances. Clothing inspection. Standard procedure, perhaps. Nothing to fear. The sergeant moved down the line, examining uniforms with professional detachment. Most received nods. A few were told to stand for closer inspection. Then he reached Elizabeth. He stopped. Looked at her dress. A civilian garment she had been wearing since capture. Faded grey cotton, patched at the elbows. He touched the fabric at her shoulder, testing its integrity. Then, without warning, he gripped the seam and pulled. The fabric tore, not violently, but deliberately. A clean rip down the shoulder seam. Elizabeth gasped. The other women stared. The sergeant stepped back, holding the torn piece of fabric, and said something in English to the private. The private opened the canvas bag and pulled out a new dress. Clean, dark blue, almost new. The sergeant handed it to Elizabeth. "This one fits better," he said in German, "and it's warmer. Change in the washroom, keep the old one if you want, or leave it for rags." Elizabeth took the dress, her hands trembling. She had expected punishment. She had received clothing. The sergeant moved on to the next woman. If this moment already changed how you see the war, subscribe. The next will surprise you even more. Elizabeth had not always been a prisoner. She had been a clerk once, working in a Luftwaffe administrative office in Bremen, processing supply requisitions and personnel transfers. She had joined in 1943, not out of ideology, but necessity. Her husband had been killed at Stalingrad, and she needed work, needed purpose, needed to believe his death had meant something. For 2 years she typed forms and filed reports, and tried not to think about what the planes overhead were doing. By April 1945, the office was rubble, and the war was over. British forces had swept through Bremen, rounding up anyone in uniform or associated with military administration. Elizabeth had been classified as auxiliary personnel. Not a combatant, but not quite a civilian either. They had transported her to England with 200 other women, packed onto a ship that crossed the Channel in rough seas. She had been sick the entire journey, clutching the railing, trying not to vomit on the women pressed around her. When they docked at Portsmouth, she could barely stand. The camp in Devon was not what she had expected. It was a converted manor estate surrounded by farmland and low stone walls. The main house served as administrative headquarters. The women were housed in wooden barracks built in the gardens. There was a fence but no barbed wire, guards but no towers. On the first day, a British officer, a major with kind eyes and careful German, had addressed them in the main hall. "You are prisoners of war under British military jurisdiction. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will work, you will be paid, you will be fed, you will be housed. Violations of camp rules will result in disciplinary action, but not abuse. Do you understand?" The women had nodded, too exhausted and confused to do anything else. Elizabeth had been assigned to the camp laundry. The work was hard, scrubbing uniforms in great tubs of hot water, wringing them by hand, hanging them on lines that stretched across a yard behind the barracks. But it was purposeful. And purpose, she was learning, was a form of survival. The first act of unexpected kindness had come 2 weeks after arrival. Elizabeth had been hanging sheets when a British corporal approached, a woman, maybe 35, with a northern accent and efficient movements. She looked at Elizabeth's hands, red, chapped, bleeding slightly at the knuckles, and frowned. "Come with me," the corporal said in broken German. Elizabeth followed her to a supply closet. The corporal pulled out a tin of hand cream, thick, medicinal, smelling of lanolin. She opened it and held it out. "Use this twice a day, after work and before bed." Elizabeth took the tin hesitantly. Why? The corporal looked at her as if the question made no sense. Because your hands are damaged, and we can prevent that. She walked away before Elizabeth could respond. That night, Elizabeth applied the cream to her hands and felt the sting of healing. She thought, they care if my hands hurt. Why do they care? She gave me cream for my hands, Elizabeth wrote later in a diary she kept on scraps of paper, as if I were a person, not a number. The system behind this care was not sentiment, it was policy, rooted in international law, enforced by military discipline, and shaped by a principle that had been articulated clearly in a 1940 War Office directive. Prisoners are soldiers, not slaves. They retain their dignity under our custody. The logic was threefold. Security. Healthy prisoners were less likely to become ill, less likely to cause unrest, easier to manage. Diplomacy. The enemy held British soldiers, and reciprocity mattered. How you treated their prisoners influenced how they treated yours. Morality, because civilization was measured not by how you treated your allies, but by how you treated your enemies. It was not perfect. There were camps where conditions were poor, where guards were harsh, where the system failed. But in most places, most of the time, it held. By the summer of 1945, Britain held over 400,000 German POWs. The majority were fed, housed and treated according to the rules. And those rules included replacing torn clothing. The days found a rhythm. Mornings began with roll call, names read from a ledger, faces checked against a list, no shouting, no aggression. Then breakfast, porridge, toast, tea. Simple food, but consistent. Elizabeth learned to trust that it would be there tomorrow. After breakfast, work assignments. Elizabeth spent her days in the laundry, scrubbing and wringing and hanging clothes until her arms ached. But the work was honest, and the guards were fair. One of them, Private Wilson, a young man from somewhere in the Midlands, supervised the laundry detail with gentle authority. He did not shout, he did not hover. He simply checked in once an hour, asked if anyone needed supplies, and then left them to work. On Elizabeth's third week, Wilson brought her a pair of rubber gloves. "For the hot water," he said. "Easier on your hands." She took the gloves. "Thank you," he shrugged. "Just makes sense." That evening, Elizabeth examined the gloves. Thick, industrial, slightly too large. She thought, he noticed my hands. A British soldier noticed my hands and did something about it. One afternoon, while Elizabeth was folding sheets, Private Wilson pulled a photograph from his pocket and showed it to her. A young woman holding a baby. "My wife," he said, "and my son. Born in March. Haven't met him yet." Elizabeth looked at the photograph. The woman was smiling. The baby was tiny, wrinkled, perfect. She looked up at Wilson. "He's beautiful." Wilson smiled, a real smile full of pride and longing. "He is. I get home in October. Can't wait." Elizabeth nodded. She thought about saying something, about her own husband, about loss, about the unbridgeable distance between her grief and his joy. But she did not. She just said, "You're very lucky." Wilson tucked the photograph away. "I am." The next day, he brought her an extra bar of soap. No explanation, just, "Thought you could use this." "He showed me his son," Elizabeth wrote. "Then he gave me soap. I don't understand kindness anymore." On Sunday evenings, the camp allowed music in the recreation hut. A gramophone, a collection of records, German and British both. The women gathered hesitantly, unsure if this was permitted or a trick, but the guards did not stop them. One, Sergeant Hayes, Welsh, with a kind face, even took requests. When Elizabeth asked if he had any Brahms, he searched through the collection and found a recording of a lullaby. The women sat and listened. Some cried quietly, some just stared at the gramophone, remembering what it felt like to hear music that was not martial, not propagandistic, just beautiful. Elizabeth closed her eyes and let the music wash over her. For 4 minutes, she was not a prisoner. She was just a woman, listening to Brahms in a hut in Devon. When the record ended, Sergeant Hayes asked, "Another?" She nodded. "Please." He played 3 more before lights out. In August, the Red Cross postal system began operating more efficiently. Elizabeth received a letter from her sister. The first word from home in 6 months. Her sister was alive, living with relatives in the countryside, working as a seamstress. Elizabeth read the letter 4 times, then sat down to write a reply. She told her sister she was safe, that she was in England, that the British were treating her humanely. She did not mention the confusion, the guilt, the sense of living in a reality that contradicted everything she had been taught. She mailed the letter at the camp post office. The British clerk checked it for security violations, stamped it, and handed her a receipt. 4 to 6 weeks, he said in broken German. Thank you. 6 weeks later, her sister's reply arrived. It said, simply, I don't understand how this is possible, but I'm grateful. Stay safe. Neither did Elizabeth. If you're seeing this war in a new light, subscribe. The next scene will challenge you even more. The transformation was gradual. Elizabeth had been told for years that the British were ruthless, that they bombed cities indiscriminately, that they treated prisoners brutally, that capture meant suffering or worse. She had believed this because everyone believed this, because the propaganda had been relentless, because doubt was dangerous. But the British did not act like the monsters she had been promised. They acted like men and women who were tired and decent and trying to finish a job. They replaced torn clothing. They provided hand cream and gloves. They played Brahms on Sunday evenings as if beauty still mattered. The propaganda cracked. Not all at once, but piece by piece, like plaster falling from a wall. One day, Elizabeth realised she was no longer afraid of the guards. She was just working alongside them, occasionally sharing observations about the weather or the quality of the soap. Private Wilson told her once, while they were folding sheets, "War's a terrible thing, but it ends, and then we have to figure out how to live with each other." Elizabeth thought about that for a long time. In September, a British quartermaster conducted a full inventory of prisoner clothing. The women were called to the supply hut in groups. Each was issued 2 dresses, 2 sets of undergarments, 1 sweater, 1 coat, 2 pairs of socks, and 1 pair of sturdy shoes. When Elizabeth received her allotment, she stared at the pile of clothing on the counter. It was more than she had owned in the last year of the war. The quartermaster, a sergeant with grey hair and a Scottish accent, noticed her expression. "Problem?" "No," Elizabeth said. "Just, this is a lot. It's winter issue, you'll need it. Gets cold here. But we're prisoners." The sergeant looked at her. "Aye, and prisoners get cold, same as anyone else." He moved on to the next woman. Elizabeth carried her clothing back to the barracks, folded it carefully, and stored it in the footlocker at the end of her cot. That night she put on the new sweater and felt its warmth, and thought, they are preparing us to survive the winter. They want us to survive. In October, the camp held a small service to mark the anniversary of the war's end in Europe. It was understated. No grand speeches, no triumphalism. Just a chaplain offering a prayer for peace and reconciliation. Elizabeth attended. She was not religious, but it felt important to mark the moment. The chaplain, an Anglican priest with a gentle voice, spoke about forgiveness, about how the hardest part of peace was learning to see the enemy as a neighbour. After the service, he approached Elizabeth. "How are you managing?" he asked in careful German. She thought about lying. Instead, she said, "I don't know how to reconcile what I was taught with what I've experienced here." He nodded. "That's the work of peace. It's harder than war." "Why?" "Because war gives you easy answers. Peace requires you to think." It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her since May. Repatriation began in November. The women were called in groups, processed, given papers, sent back to Germany or to displaced persons camps if they had nowhere to go. Elizabeth was in the 3rd group. She packed her small bundle, the clothing, the hand cream, the diary written on scraps of paper. Private Wilson gave her a bar of chocolate on the morning she left. "For the journey," he said. She took it. "Thank you for everything." He shrugged. "Just did what I could. It was more than that." He looked at her for a moment, then nodded. "Good luck, miss. I hope you find what you're looking for." She did not know what she was looking for, but she appreciated the sentiment. Elizabeth found her sister in December 1945. They held each other and cried and did not speak for a long time. There were no words large enough for what they had survived. Elizabeth stayed in Germany. She worked as a translator for the British occupation forces, then as a secretary in a school. She married again in 1953. a shopkeeper, kind, patient, and had 2 daughters. She kept the blue dress the sergeant had given her for the rest of her life. She wore it on special occasions, mended it carefully when it frayed, and eventually passed it on to her eldest daughter. She never spoke about the war, but every time she mended clothing, she thought about a British sergeant who had torn a dress to replace it with something better. Every time she applied hand cream, she thought about a corporal who had noticed her damaged hands. She kept the tin of hand cream, empty but preserved, in a drawer beside her bed. In 1987, Elizabeth returned to England. She took a train to Devon and found the old estate, still standing, converted into a conference centre. She walked through the grounds where the barracks had been, where the laundry lines had stretched, where she had first learned that enemies could be kind. She stood in what had been the laundry yard and thought, "This is where I learned that civilization was a choice. That decency was possible even in defeat." She did not go inside. She just stood there for a while, remembering the sergeant who had torn her dress, the corporal who had given her hand cream, the private who had shown her a photograph of his son. Then she left. The sergeant had gripped the fabric at her shoulder and pulled. The women had gasped. Elizabeth had braced for humiliation. What she received instead was a new dress, warmer, better fitted, offered without ceremony or explanation. If this story reminded you that history is written in gestures as much as battles, subscribe. You'll find more truths here than in any textbook. In 2004, Elizabeth died peacefully in her sleep. Her daughters found a box in her closet, letters, photographs, and a blue dress carefully folded and wrapped in tissue paper. One letter, written but never sent, was addressed to the British sergeant whose name she had never learned. It said, in careful English, "You tore my dress to give me something better. You saw my need before I could name it. You treated me with dignity when I had none left. Thank you." The daughters could not deliver the letter, but they kept it anyway, along with the dress, because some gratitude does not need a recipient. It just needs to exist. The morning sun had filtered through the windows of the medical hut. The women had sat in silence, waiting for inspection. The sergeant had gripped the fabric at Elizabeth's shoulder and pulled. She had expected violence. She had received care. The war had taught them fear. The peace taught them mercy. And mercy, they learned, was not the absence of cruelty. It was the presence of attention, a sergeant who noticed worn fabric, a system that said replacement was not a luxury but a right, a civilization that insisted even prisoners deserve warmth. That was the measure of a society. Not how it treated its heroes, but how it treated its captives. Not the speeches or the parades, but the quiet moment when a soldier tears a dress and hands you a better one, as if your comfort were still a thing worth preserving. The war had ended, but the lesson remained that decency, however small, was always a choice. And some people chose it, even when no one was watching.